Well, good evening. It's good to be here tonight. Thank you all for being here today. And I want to begin this last session with a prayer, the collect for Palm Sunday, because we are coming up on Holy Week, and I'll show you kind of. I'll talk about why this speech tonight, Barbara Jordan, I think might be an interesting one for Holy Week. So uh, pray with me as we as we begin tonight. Almighty and ever living God, in your tender love for the human race, you sent your Son, our Savior Jesus Christ, to take upon him our nature and to suffer death upon the cross, giving us an example of his great humility. Mercifully grant that we may walk in the way of his suffering and also share in his resurrection through Jesus Christ our Lord, who lives and reigns with you in the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever. Amen. Collect for Palm Sunday. And let me share the screen. Slideshow. So, what I want to do tonight, a different night because this is the last of the classes. Um, I want to kind of review a little where we've been and then give a little historical background on Barbara Jordan. A lot of this I pull straight from the internet, from the History Channel. Thank you. Because the podcast, if you listen to it, does some of that work as well. But just to kind of get everybody to where she is, who she is. And then the speech is about 10 minutes, I think. Um, at least there's a 10-minute clip on the internet. Um, but I'll fast forward through the clapping, which there was a ton of clapping. And if you listen to the podcast, that's an important thing. So we'll listen to the speech and then kind of have some discussion about the speech and then also kind of just tie up the entire series. I definitely will want your reactions to her speech and maybe some of the things I'm looking at when we go into it, but then also just kind of um, why what you've heard, what you've learned, what you've maybe already heard it before, and maybe you've already learned it before, but why maybe these speeches are important at this moment in our history, and as people of faith, what we've learned from that in this Lenten season, a season I think um, where we're called to go deeper into our past, into the sins of our past, and into kind of deeper into who we are as people of faith, as Christians, and also to 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 kind of do the work of reconciliation, which in some levels kind of political. The word politics isn't my way or your way. It's kind of a conversation, and so I'll because I love history. I think these are great conversation partners, and what they provide in these speeches has been that for us. So we'll talk about that tonight. Again, this is all from. Want to be since we're on the World Wide Web right now. Want to be very clear. This is all from John Meacham. These podcasts are from John Meacham. This idea was from John Meacham. And it was said, I think the power as people of faith at St. John's in the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. This idea of word, not only our words, that it's a living word, the words that we speak. Maybe that's one thing we could talk about tonight. Words matter is what we've kind of seen as people talk about with some of the tragic events that are happening right now. That how we use speech um, is really important. And so I think what Meacham has done in this podcast as a historian is here's some really amazing speeches that inspire the nation and that have kind of been in the that should be a part of the nation's kind of repertoire of great speeches. I pulled the five for basically reasons of just what I thought were the most theological. The other five are just as good. So I knew we were in the season of Lent, and I wanted things to go theologically and to use titles that I thought were pretty theological. Tonight would be my biggest stretch, so we'll see if I do it correctly. My other two were very easy. My other four, sorry, were very easy. We started with Martin Luther King, right? With not the I Have a Dream streets, but I've seen the mountaintop. The mountaintop, obviously a very biblical image, and he knew what he was doing. He was a pastor, and so that yeah, he how much I used to get the kids to do when I taught high school was to read those speeches and to see how much scripture was really used. I mean, these were all he was steeped in scripture and how important that was for him. So we began there. Then we went to Robert F. Kennedy and basically an impromptu 5-minute speech, if you listen to that one. No notes, sat up on the stage and talked about empathy. We talked about how it was the first time, and many historians would argue that he ever talked about his brother's death, and how kind of that was the suffering was a connection, suffering was a bridge. And as we're in Lent, we'll talk about that. I'll flip the next slide. The following week, we went down to President Obama. Had a great time listening to that a sermon, which was a sermon. I mean, it was a political speech, but it was at a eulogy for Reverend Pinckney at Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston, South Carolina, and it was a sermon. He started with Hebrews, right? The Hebrews, he started with Scripture. Faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things unseen. He went straight into that, and it was a sermon, and it ended with him singing "Amazing Grace." Um, and then we had President Reagan last week. A different sort of farewell, and a very we talked about his style, his delivery, very uh, just Ronald Reagan, right? And but the title of that, right, was and how it's become known as the speech is it's City Upon a Hill, which is taken from Matthew's Gospel, the Sermon on the Mount, and to kind of live into the vision of who we are as a country. Freedom was big for him, and the values of our country were big, and having those conversations. And I think as people of faith, we have to do that, and that's part of Lent, right? Part of growing in grace that we've been doing is being reminded the basic things of having those conversations with one another about what it means to be people of faith is really important. Each of these in their weird sick sort of way. Weird sick, it's not weird sick, it's holy, it was just ironical, it's a kind of holy irony how those speeches, because I'm a decent planner but not the best planner, they did sync eerily with some of the gospel passages we heard. Reagan maybe was a little different. Um, but last Sunday's reading was what Jeremiah. I want to write these things on your heart, right? That was a lot like Reagan's last speech. But we did look at some biblical themes. Obviously, the mountaintop with Martin Luther King, Moses in the mountaintop. There's a very Mosaic quality. He knew he wasn't going to make it with him. And actually, I think we looked at that one. We're hearing from Moses. The next week was about Corinthians. Was that empathy, the suffering um, of Robert F. Kennedy, and kind of speaking to King's death, and how he used that suffering. There's the cross as the bridge, and I really think as Christians, that's what the cross enables us to do. We bring our suffering to the cross, um, and we reach others. We talk about Henry Nouwen wrote one of the great books, if you've never read it, a great spiritual book called The Wounded Healer. The Wounded Healer. Write that one down. That it's through our wounds, through our own suffering, that we can be agents of healing to others. And you really saw that on display. I could do a whole nother course on that one. One of the most powerful books by Nouwen. Um, then Barack Obama's speech happened to be eerily another kind of moment. Amazing Grace. That Sunday we went to church after this Wednesday night class, and we heard Nicodemus. We heard the lessons from Nicodemus in Jesus, which is about grace. God so loved the world. It was John 3:16 that day. And again, last week was more focused on kind of the Ten Commandments and the Sermon on the Mount, but you did hear that passage from Jeremiah. I'm going to write a new covenant in their heart, um, and so a reminder of that covenant that we make. And I think that was a farewell address from Reagan, reminding us about American values and to to appreciate that and know the fragility. I think that was one of the things we could have talked about at the end about how, and this is something Reagan believed, that this is a very fragile country, and we have to it can within a generation those ideas can evaporate and to to honor one another and to be able to have political discourse that we can't have, that we're not doing very well of having right now. um, so this week is Palm Sunday. I began with the Palm Sunday prayer, and I'm doing that for a reason. As we get into Barbara Jordan, it is Holy Week. Palm Sunday and Holy Week. Palm Sunday kicks off Holy Week, and of all the weeks in the year, and all the churches across Christendom, Protestant, Catholics, all of our brothers and sisters, um, in years past, this has often been called, I think, the week of Christian unity, because um, we can come together. This is one thing we share in common, right? We do a lot of things different. We have a lot of different beliefs, but we walk this journey together, from the triumphal entry to the Last Supper to the crucifixion to the resurrection. This is something we all hold in common, um, and so I I want us to situate that, the fact that we're coming into Holy Week, into Barbara Jordan's speech tonight. This might be the way I'm using this. Why? Why is Barbara Jordan's speech very important? Well, it happens on the bicentennial, right? 1776. It happens in 1976. There was definitely an implicit sort of, let's go back to the most important, most fundamental part of our kind of country, um, of who we are and what type of people we're supposed to be. Somebody that has definitely been excluded from that narrative, right? That's a part of her story, and how on this kind of bicentennial, this big moment in history, she steps on a stage and reminds the country of who they are and what they're about. So I want to ground tonight in tonight's speech, and kind of in a very sort of Holy Week sort of moment, that she reminds the country at on that podium of who we are and who we're called to be, of unity. You'll hear some themes about unity. You'll hear some um, themes just about American values, and the vision of this country. So um, granted that in that spiritual and this liturgical and spiritual week that we're coming upon. A little background about her. I don't have a lot of background pictures. She was born in Houston. She's a Texan through and through. Father was a Baptist minister and a warehouse clerk. Again, I think you're going to hear the level, as we've talked about this in a number of weeks. Uh, just how these, it's not that long ago. I mean, it's not many years before I was born, but just two, that people speak at such a beautiful, I mean, the way in which he speaks is so eloquent and poetic. Um, and we talked about that a few weeks ago. We can ramble about that when we get through. Um, and with Robert F. Kennedy, I mean, kind of with no notes and was just eloquent. And so just, we're going to be back in the 60s and 70s, um, listening to, and same with King. Listen to somebody beautiful, a poet, right here tonight. Mother was a maid, housewife, church teacher. Um, so she's definitely steeped in. She's obviously steeped in a biblical tradition, and I do think underlying this message is one of hope. I think that's where she leads us. Yeah, we've got some work to do, but there's an optimism, there's a hopefulness, in all these speeches. She's, yeah, attended a segregated school. So she grew up in the segregated South. She was inspired to become an attorney when she was at Texas Southern. This is a good little fact I found on the History Channel. She was a part of this the debate team, and when Harvard debaters came to town, they tied. The Harvard debaters. So that had to be pretty impressive for that to happen. So she's definitely going to see in her speech. She's definitely got that. She went on to law school at Boston University. Um, 3 years later, she earned the law degree, one of the two only African American women in her class, and then she passed two bars: the Massachusetts State Bar and the Texas Bar. So, um, yeah, I think passing one bar is an accomplishment. Doing two is got to be pretty tough. And then went home and opened up a law office in the Fifth Ward. Um, she starts her career at a state level. She tried running unsuccessfully twice. Um, I think I put that in twice, so apologies for that. In her final year, um, so then I think she did, yeah, she did run again. So sorry, I deleted a bullet point here. She did run, she didn't make it, and in in her final years in 1972, she was able to serve as the governor for the day for pro tem. Um, she later, after she ran at state level, she ran for Congress in the 18th district. Um, she became the first African American woman from a southern state to serve in the House of Reps. So she's crossing a lot of barriers. Um, and then Lyndon B. Johnson obviously a Texan as well, put her on the House Judiciary Committee, right? And this is where, if you listen to the podcast, where she really became known, because it was Nixon's impeachment that put her on the map. And there's, that's a speech, that's 2 minute speech. It's definitely in the podcast. You can hear kind of her comments on that. And that, and I think what you'll see tonight, I'll fast forward it or go back a little, because of that stage, because of what she said in that impeachment trial, you see a standing ovation when she comes to the floor. She said it, um, yeah, right here. She said, "I'm not going to sit here and be an idle spectator in the diminution, the subversion, the destruction of the Constitution." So, I mean, even most of those words, I almost need a thesaurus for. I mean, she's extremely articulate and extremely smart at a high level. And I do wonder. I mean, I'm going to throw it out there that given that moment in time, and she almost had to be more verbose um, because of the prejudice. People didn't think she probably could do it. So I wonder if that's some of the language. But she's so poetic. She is an effective communicator. Um, yeah. So the as I kind of jumped into the slide. 2 years after that, they put her on the national stage. 2 years after that, she's delivering. She becomes the keynote address to the 1976 Democratic National Convention. I do think other African Americans had spoken before at conventions, but the distinction is she became a keynote speaker, um, if, if I understand history correctly. Um, yep, she promoted women's just for everybody to know, more legislation on women's rights, equal rights amendment. Um, Granted housewives social security benefits on their domestic labor. So a lot of the stuff. I mean, she stayed true to really who she was, how she grew up in her career, and later went on to be a professor back at the LBJ School of Public Affairs. 25 honorary degrees. I'd say that's a lot of honorary degrees. And then ultimately ended was pretty sick. She gave a second Democratic Convention keynote address in 1992, um, and died of diabetes and cancer. In '94, Clinton gave her a Presidential Medal of Freedom. Uh, yeah, leukemia-related pneumonia in January 1996. And another way in which she broke barriers here tonight, even in death, she became the first African American to be buried among the governors, senators, and congressmen in the Texas State Cemetery. So, um, Texan through and through. Let me end this screen if I can. Um, Stop share. Well, stop share. I want to go to my speech and share the screen here. And let's listen to the speech, and then we'll have some discussion and call it a night. Let me know if you can hear. Just thumbs up. The verbiage is a little off.
This is by far the biggest ovation anyone has received here in this opening session of the Democratic Convention. First time the convention has really come alive on this first night. Barbara Jordan, Congresswoman.
Okay, there was another keynote speaker, I should say. It's not Neil Armstrong, the astronaut. I'm blanking on the name. Um, who was it?
John Glenn.
I don't think it was John Glenn. Give me another one. There was another keynote speaker. Maybe somebody can Google that and find who that is. But he went first, and it was kind of lackluster according to John Meacham's podcast. And so when she comes on, and you'll see, it became very, very electric. So just so when he said now the crowd's livened up, I mean, I think he was really kind of speaking to the moment. It was kind of dead. And she can't get them quiet. This goes on for 2 minutes before a word's spoken.
Ladies and gentlemen, in case you don't know it, may I now present our second keynote speaker, the Honorable Barbara Jordan, Democrat of Houston, Texas. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for a very warm reception. It was 144 years ago that members of the Democratic Party first met in convention to select a presidential candidate. Since that time, Democrats have continued to convene once every 4 years and draft a party platform and nominate a presidential candidate. And our meeting this week is a continuation of that tradition. But there is something different about tonight. There is something special about tonight. What is different? What is special? I, Barbara Jordan, am a keynote speaker.
Look at the guy smoking right next to the podium.
Years passed since 1832, and during that time, it would have been most unusual for any national political party to ask Barbara Jordan to deliver a keynote address. But tonight, here I am. And I feel that notwithstanding the past, that my presence here is one additional bit of evidence that the American dream need not forever be deferred. Now that I have this grand distinction, what in the world am I supposed to say? I could easily spend this time praising the accomplishments of this party and attacking the Republicans, but I don't choose to do that. I could list the many problems which Americans have. I could list the problems which cause people to feel cynical, angry, frustrated. Problems which include lack of integrity in government, the feeling that the individual no longer counts, the reality of material and spiritual poverty, the feeling that the grand American experiment is failing or has failed. I could recite these problems, and then I could sit down and offer no solutions. But I don't choose to do that either. The citizens of America expect more, deserve, and they want more than a recital of problems. We are a people in a quandary about the present. We are a people in search of our future. We are a people in search of a national community. We are a people
trying not only to solve the problems of the present, unemployment, inflation, but we are attempting on a larger scale to fulfill the promise of America. We are attempting to fulfill our national purpose to create and sustain a society in which all of us are equal. Throughout our history, when people have looked for new ways to solve their problems and to uphold the principles of this nation, many times they have turned to political parties. They have often turned to the Democratic Party. What is it? What is it about the Democratic Party that makes it the instrument the people use when they search for ways to shape their future? Well, I believe the answer to that question lies in our concept of governing. Our concept of governing is derived from our view of people. It is a concept deeply rooted in a set of beliefs firmly etched in the national conscience of all of us. Now, what are these beliefs? First, we believe in equality for all and privileges for none. This is a belief that each American, regardless of background, has equal standing in the public forum, all of us. Because we believe this idea so firmly, we are an inclusive rather than an exclusive party. Let everybody come. I think it no accident that most of those immigrating to America in the 19th century identified with the Democratic Party. We are a heterogeneous party made up of Americans of diverse backgrounds. We believe that the people are the source of all governmental power, that the authority of the people is to be extended, not restricted. This can be accomplished only by providing each citizen with every opportunity to participate in the management of the government. They must have that. We believe that the government, which represents the authority of all the people, not just one interest group, but all the people, has an obligation to actively seek to remove those obstacles which would block individual achievement, obstacles emanating from race, sex, economic condition. The government must remove them, seek to remove them. We are a party of innovation. We do not reject our traditions, but we are willing to adapt to changing circumstances. When change we must, we are willing to suffer the discomfort of change in order to achieve a better future. We have a positive vision of the future founded on the belief that the gap between the promise and reality of America can one day be finally closed. We believe that. This, my friends, is the bedrock of our concept of governing. This is a part of the reason why Americans have turned to the Democratic Party. These are the foundations upon which a national community can be built. Let all understand that these guiding principles cannot be discarded for short-term political gains. They represent what this country is all about. They are indigenous to the American idea, and these are principles which are not negotiable.
I could go on to the last few minutes where she quotes Lincoln, but we don't have the whole night. What are your thoughts on the first 8 minutes or 12 minutes of her speech? If you've listened to the podcast.
That I wish I'd listened to her over the last 5 years, at least once a month.
So let me put these. I'll put the discussion questions. That's all the.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I do think that there's there's another 8 minutes of the speech that we don't have time to hear, but from the get-go, I mean, I think, Philip, you're right. She is one of the things I find kind of fascinating in today's world, and I'll throw a jab at both parties on political parties here, is that, each party stands in opposition to the other party, but I'm not really sure what they stand for. and
Right.
maybe the history of that. And so, boy, she just stumps out and says, here is what it means to be a Democrat. Here's how that sinks into the American ideology. And boom, in a way that I don't think any Democrat could be that articulate, or a Republican at this moment in time, about what their party's platforms are, other than we don't like what the other person's doing. And that's just not helpful.
I'm trying to think of how a Republican would argue her points. She's not being that very much bipartisan, she's I don't know how a Republican would.
No, I think
she is kind of bolstering the Democratic Party, saying these are our values, but she's choosing values that Republicans might say they have too.
exactly. No, I think you're right on that. And the fact that what I could go back and grab is that she ends with Lincoln. I mean, she's like, let me end with a Republican. And if you listen to the podcast, she ends with a quote from Lincoln. So you're right. She's speaking to the convention, but she's also speaking to a larger national audience she knows that is watching, which is what a gift. What a gift. What else did you all hear on that? Get her and remember the context. It's 1776, 1976. So I think she's aware of that moment too.
I'll also say that, I was making a little bit of a judgment on, the Trump era here that we're going past, but no, actually, I mean, even in my college and bringing up in my education, I have never heard of Barbara Jordan. I'm from Texas, and I didn't know about that speech, and I wish I had known about it sooner. She's really impressed me.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I don't think I remember reading it in college as well. So I'm sure.
I will date myself here. I remember Barbara Jordan, and I much admired her, and the significance of her being the first, I guess, female African-American keynote speaker on a national stage. It embodied, I think, what she stood for and how much she achieved. And yes, throwing out there, this is what we as the Democratic Party believe and what we can look forward to. She was an outstanding person. I mean, she was clearly a good politician, but so smart. I mean, you could just, everything she said was always very articulate. I'm not sure how I can relate it to going into Holy Week, but
Well, no, you don't have to do.
uh,
I think in the sense of kind of being back in a historical moment in time. I think she kind of threw her Holy Week out there in the sense of it's a centering moment for Christians. It's a time where you go back and think of this is who we are and why we behave and live. This is an annual celebration that reminds us who we are and how we are to live in this world. And I think at a kind of fundamental moment in our nation's history in 1976, that her kind of eminence on that stage is, and her words are a reminder of who we are as Americans. Does that make sense? That's not a tight
mhm,
comparison here, but I think in that moment, it's kind of she comes back to says, hey, let me remind you of who we are as a country. Um, and even there as somebody excluded from that narrative for a while. Um, and so that's, yeah, there's no tight. I'm not saying she's Jesus, but I'm just saying she kind of does that in a powerful um, reminder of
mm.
this is what it means to be an American. Let me tell you about these ideas. What else did you hear? Joanne, you put the camera on, but you didn't.
Yeah. There. Well, I mean, I think she was giving out a call also to live up to those. That, this is what I liked her. This is what we believe. A call back to what we stand for, what we believe. And for me, listening to all 5 of these speeches, we just don't hear speeches like this anymore, and it's just, I don't know. It just seems like we need to be called back because we don't hear speeches like this anymore. So articulate, so inclusive, so, and she even used that term, we're inclusive, not exclusive, so that's what I got out of it, was just a call to remember who we are and call back to it.
Thank you. I think both you, Joanne and Philip, said something very insightful. I mean, and again, I don't want to get totally into politics and beat up our political parties, but our conventions now, and I think back then as well. I mean, they're there to rally the base, right? But the narrative, I think, of some of these speeches is not just to rally the base, but actually to the largest audience. And I think what we see today is like, let me say something that just gets my base fired up. And those words is, as I think, as you all are articulating, and kind of reminded me of yeah, they weren't to the base, they were to the country. Um, Winifred.
Yes, she mentioned something about being the party of innovation, and she indicated that it wouldn't be easy, and we must suffer the discomfort of change. I liked that. She's letting us know it won't be easy. It will be difficult.
That was a yep, very truthful line,
It's
very truthful lines. And
it's
as
it's
you,
right, and it's not, but it's difficult.
yeah, and
It's the right way, but it's difficult.
uh-huh.
Way. Excuse me. Sorry.
No, you're
Go ahead.
good. I think y'all are right on it. I mean, and I think that's an important reminder, as people of faith, as we enter the week that we're entering into, um, that was as disciples, that what we're going to hear in the narrative in the week to come in church, is Jesus trying to tell the disciples, this is this is what you think it's going to be, but you're going to have to change your understanding of messiahship. You're going to have to change your understanding of discipleship, and it's not going to be easy. And from our basic from our basic Christian beliefs, we know that to be true as followers of Jesus, but also in our national narrative, right? As you all both bring up, that's so fundamental as well. That Americans have to be innovative, and that's what made the greatest generation the greatest generation. I mean, in every generation has their own things they do, but yeah, I think thank you for that, Winifred. I think that's a very insightful. I loved one little thing from the beginning, and y'all can go back and listen to it again on your own time. I loved it. Um, I'm not going to attack the Republicans. That's how she began it. Don't hear that today, because that seems to be that's the excitement. And then I'm not going to lament about all the problems. So she kind of named the problems, and she said she was going to lament them, but that's okay. But she's like, I'm not going to. My speech isn't going to be about that. She said, my topic is I'm in search of a future and of a national community. And isn't that, I think, some of the work of the church? Um, we can get so bogged down in our problems. We can get so bogged down in our church's problems. We can get so bogged down in how we're not functioning. And Winterford is the church. We can, we need to be innovative. We need to be thinking innovation. But we also, I think, our task as a church in the world today is to point people toward a future and that national community. So I think she's actually preaching there. Um, um, I think what we don't have in today's world is community, and I mean at the center of our liturgy, probably at the apex of our liturgy, is communion, which is community. And ecclesia, as Chris Schwenk reminded us a few weeks ago, is gathering. It's community. The very word church means that. But boy, don't we get up there and lament about problems and pick people apart when we speak. So it's a great order.
I'm trying to remember my history. There was the big change, right? There was the McCarthyism that was happening in the 60s or the 50s. And the Democratic Party was not initially the civil rights party, but it had slowly shifted to that position before 1776. I mean, I'm sorry, 1976.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to remember all this there, and I'm trying to frame her words on, and I'm trying to imagine that was before I was born. And so, but I do need to listen to this again and maybe review my history.
Yeah, and if you go into and out again, I go back to the old church, the old school history. But if it's in the 20th century, I'm kind of getting a little sketchy here. So take it for what it's worth. But I did think one of the things Meacham did mention in that podcast and since he's written a lot of books about this, I trust him on this, is that when we got to the Robert F. Kennedy speech about how in 64 when in 64 when JFK ran for office. Was it 64, right, guys? Nod your head if I'm right or wrong. 64. But was it earlier? Was it 60? 60. When he ran and when he got King out of jail. Remember that from that podcast? It was he made a call when King was in jail in Atlanta, and Daddy King delivered a lot of those votes from Martin Luther King's father, helped deliver those votes. That was a defining moment in kind of the parties, because and one of the reasons he did that politically, you go back and listen to that podcast, was because they had the Dixiecrats, the kind of Southern conservative Democrats, but they needed the black vote. And so there was a strategy in that, and that was some of Robert Kennedy was going along with that, and kind of, but yet wanting to kind of manage King. And then suddenly, if you remember that class and that podcast, is when he was basically eavesdropping King, listening to King, that he became converted. Kind of a very Pauline sort of thing, and so that was a really interesting podcast. If you want to go back, and I think Philip, to your question of when did the black votes kind of move to the Democratic Party, I think Meacham did kind of talk about that in that podcast. I'm looking at the last few minutes. Anything you want to say about the whole series in general, or faith and culture, or just one last jab? Wallace, thanks, but this was a crazy series, and don't do it again. But that's all fair game too.
Oh,
Oh,
I
no, no,
really
no.
enjoyed it. I sorry, y'all. I really, really enjoyed it, and I appreciate the way that you frame it in the Christian belief system. And to me, you can't separate um, activism and social justice from our Christian beliefs. So I think it's been really, really good, and I appreciate it.
Thank you. I'm reading a lot of Augustine for Lent and the Two Kingdoms. I mean, you can we live in this world, and we participate in this world, but yet we are of a different world. So it's nice to hear. I think each of these individuals was very rooted in their faith and very active in the politics of the day, and I think that emanates in how they govern and how they lead. So thank you, Pepper.
I missed the first one, but I enjoyed the other four. It was wonderful.
These are all recorded, unfortunately, for posterity's sake.
Thanks for that, Father Wallace.
You said only good things. Any other comments?
Yeah, I wouldn't advise you to do it every year, like just to bring different kind of things to the classroom. But this would be great before, instead of after a change of president, but maybe before a vote. I guess that's kind of crossing a line of politics that you're not supposed to do in a church. But
Thank you, Phil.
I'll put it out there,
Yeah,
because they are, as long as you stay inspirational and bipartisan, and you really can't. Yeah, I mean, you talk about history. I don't know. Well,
yeah. Well, and a good reminder of Father Dave's class, that the Healing the Heart of Democracy, that was a great hit, with the Ollie series, was a great one for a presidential election. It was more of a kind of abstract class. I mean, I do think this is good afterwards because you've got different political parties, but I'd be a little scared to do it before. Yeah, and we wouldn't do this every year, but there was something. John Meacham did a lot of the legwork, so I was just kind of jumping off that, and I thought his podcast, It Was Said, was a good one, and as well as he's got another one. There's two of them out there. I forgot what the other one's called, um, but other kind of historical moments. Oh, what was the other one called? Where he looks at like the flu, the Spanish flu. He looks at polio. I mean, so there's some really contemporary stuff, and kind of how it kind of shaped America, and America responded to that. So there's some really good podcasts out there.
yeah. Please repeat this in the future.
Thank you.
Maybe in a couple of years you can do the other 5 speeches.
Yeah. Now those were pretty interesting stuff. I did actually, there were some really good ones in there. There was one of the ones was Meghan McCain was really going after the president. So that was a pretty interesting one. If you hadn't watched that one, that's a good one.
I can imagine.
So it was John McCain died, and obviously the 45th president and John McCain saw things differently. And
Yeah.
on his deathbed, John McCain said, "Give him hell," and she did. So that's an interesting podcast. But anyhow, thank you for joining me. Thank you for walking through this, and again, remind you of a lot of the stuff going on. And again, I think, as I've said before in many classes, conversation is the Latin root for conversion, and politics is actually supposed to be a conversation. So, as people of faith and as people of this world. I'm glad we can get together and talk and listen to some historical speeches, and I hope that as things get crazy in our world, that maybe you had 5 speeches to draw people back to refer people to. This becomes something you can put in your pocket and talk from it and refer people to it. So thank you all for being with us, being with me, and I look forward to seeing you soon.
Okay.
Go
Thank
in
you.
peace to love and serve the Lord.
Thank
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Good night, everyone.
Night, night.
Night.